She was 21 years old when the world took everything from her and left her holding a receipt for $40 and the key to a ruin nobody else wanted. Her name was Adeline Coulter, and by the late spring of 1888, in the river town of Belhaven Hollow, Kentucky, she had buried her father, lost her family's cooperative shop to a debt she never saw signed, and stood on the courthouse steps with the whole of her worldly fortune folded twice inside her glove. The man who had done this to her was Silas Crane, loan officer of the Larkspur County Bank, a man with soft hands and a softer voice who had smiled at her the whole time he ruined her. With what little remained, she did not buy bread, or a train ticket, or a room to sleep in. She bought a heap of blackened stone and rotting timber at the edge of town that everyone called cursed, the old Belhaven Distillery, shuttered since before she was born, repossessed by the bank decades ago and never sold, because folks said the man who built it had vanished into the dark one November night and never came home. It seemed the most foolish purchase a ruined young woman could make, but sealed behind one wall of that condemned old building was a secret that would not only change the whole shape of her life, it would set right a wrong that had been quietly poisoning her town for 30 years. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Adeline Coulter. If you have ever stood at the edge of losing everything and found yourself reaching for the one thing nobody else wanted, we made this story for you. Before we go further, we want to say, if you're new here, we'd love for you to stay a while. Consider following or subscribing to this channel, because we tell stories like this every week. Stories about ordinary people who are underestimated and overlooked, and who rise anyway. And wherever you're watching from tonight, whatever town, whatever country, whatever hour it is where you are, tell us in the comments. We read every single one, and we'd love to know who's sitting with us for this one. Adeline Coulter had grown up with the smell of white oak shavings in her hair. Her father, Ezra Coulter, was the finest cooper in 3 counties, a broad, quiet man whose hands could read the grain of a stave the way other men read scripture, and who had raised his only daughter not as a delicate thing to be sheltered from his trade, but as a partner in it. Her mother had died bringing her into the world, and so it had always been the two of them, father and daughter, in the low wooden shop on Perry Street, with its ring of iron hoops hanging from the rafters like great dark halos. By the time she was 10, Adeline could tell a well-seasoned oak stave from a green one just by its weight in her palm. By 14, she could raise a barrel from bare staves to a tight singing vessel that would hold whiskey or cider or rainwater without a drop escaping. And she took a fierce, private pride in the fact that men twice her age would bring their broken barrels to her father's shop and leave them, unknowingly, in the hands of a girl. Ezra Coulter believed in a particular kind of faith, one he taught his daughter more through the shape of his days than through any sermon. He believed that value was often disguised as worthlessness, that the world was careless about what it discarded, and that a person who paid attention, who really looked, who ran her fingers along the grain instead of trusting the surface, could find worth where others saw only ruin. He would gather cracked and abandoned barrels from the tavern yards and the old Distillery road, barrels that other coopers wrote off as firewood, and he would set Adeline to work steaming and reshaping the staves, showing her how even split, warped, sun-silvered wood could be coaxed back into something whole and useful, if you were patient enough and humble enough to listen to what the material was telling you rather than what your eyes assumed. "Nobody discards gold, Addie," he used to say, tapping a ruined stave against his knee. "They only discard what they've stopped looking at closely." She did not know then how literally that lesson would one day save her. She grew up, too, with an old, quiet reverence for the abandoned distillery at the edge of town, the one everyone called the Belhaven Ruin. It sat above the river on a rise of land, its limestone walls still standing tall and pale even after decades of neglect. Its roof half collapsed, its great copper stills long since sold for scrap or stolen by boys daring each other to trespass. The story that hung over it, passed down like a ghost story around Belhaven Hollow's hearths, was that its founder, Thomas Belhaven, the very man the town was named for, had built the finest whiskey house in the region, prosperous and beloved, employing half the town at its peak, until the autumn of 1857, when bank examiners came calling, and Thomas Belhaven vanished from Belhaven Hollow Inn, the middle of the night, and was never seen again. The town's version of the story, repeated so often it had calcified into fact, was that Belhaven had embezzled from the very bank that financed his distillery, panicked when the auditors arrived, and fled with what he had stolen, abandoning his workers, his debts, and his good name in one cowardly stroke. The distillery was seized by the bank soon after, its debts called in, its doors shut, and no one in 3 decades had wanted to touch it, as though failure itself might be contagious in the old stone. Ezra Coulter had never quite believed that story, though he rarely said so aloud. He had known Thomas Belhaven's foreman, an old, taciturn man named Jubal Reese, who had worked the distillery until its closing and lived out his last years in a cabin by the mill pond. And Ezra sometimes said that Jubal used to mutter, in his cups, that Thomas Belhaven was the most honest man who ever poured a spirit, and that there was more to his vanishing than the bank ever let on. But Jubal Reese had died when Adeline was still a child, taking whatever he knew to his grave, and the story of Thomas Belhaven's disgrace had long since hardened into the only truth Belhaven Hollow cared to remember. Adeline carried her father's quiet skepticism about easy stories, along with his coopering skill and his stubborn, unglamorous faith in overlooked things, into her own young womanhood, never guessing how soon she would need every scrap of it. The fall came on her the way a river rises, slowly, and then all at once. Ezra Coulter took a fever in the wet cold of the previous November, the kind of lingering sickness that settles into a man's lungs and will not be argued with. And by the following March, he was gone, leaving Adeline alone at 21 with the shop, the modest house behind it, and what she believed was a clean name and a paid debt. It was Silas Crane, the bank's mild-mannered loan officer, who came calling within the month, dressed in his good gray coat, expressing a sorrow so smooth it barely disturbed his face, to inform her that her father had, in fact, taken out a loan against the cooperative shop 3 years prior. A loan, Crane said, secured for the purchase of seasoned oak stock from Ohio, a loan that had gone unpaid since Ezra's illness began, and that the bank now had no choice but to call. Adeline had never seen any such note in her father's careful ledgers. She said as much, and Crane produced a paper bearing what appeared to be her father's signature. A signature slightly too round, slightly too eager in its loops, compared to the tight, economical hand she had watched cross 1,000 invoices at their kitchen table. She could not prove it was false. She had no lawyer, no money for one, and no standing in a county where the bank's word carried the weight of scripture, and a grieving orphaned cooper's daughter carried very little at all. Within 8 weeks the shop was posted for auction. Within 12 it was sold, along with the house behind it, to settle a debt Adeline was certain to her bones her father had never made. She stood in the small crowd at the courthouse steps and watched strangers bid on her father's tools, on the very lathe her hands had learned their trade upon. And Silas Crane stood near the auctioneer, with his hat in his hands, and an expression of practiced regret. And something in the too careful stillness of his face told her, with a certainty she could not have explained to a judge, that he was not sorry at all. When the shop and house were sold and the debt was declared satisfied, There was a small remainder due back to her, as the law required, and it came to $46, the entire sum of what her 21 years had left her in the world. She stood on those courthouse steps that hot June afternoon with that money in her glove, homeless, orphaned, and without a trade to practice since her tools now belonged to a stranger. And she watched the auctioneer move on to the next item on his docket, almost as an afterthought. A decades-old distillery ruin the county had inherited through a debt so old and so long forgotten that even the ledger listing it was yellow and curling at its corners. Property known as the Belhaven Distillery, the auctioneer called out, barely troubling to raise his voice, sold as is, no title guaranteed beyond the deed itself, structure unsound, opening bid $1. A ripple of low laughter went through the crowd. Nobody wanted it. Nobody had wanted it in 30 years. It was the town's cursed place, the failure everyone pointed to. The ruined children were dared to run past at dusk, and Adeline Coulter, standing with the last of her inheritance in her glove and nowhere in the world left to sleep that night, heard her father's voice as clearly as if he stood beside her. Nobody discards gold. Addie, they only discard what they've stopped looking at closely. And before she had entirely decided to, she heard her own voice call out, $40, into the startled silence of the courthouse yard. There was no other bidder. The auctioneer, faintly amused, faintly pitying, brought down his gavel, and just like that, Adeline Coulter, orphaned and penniless, and without a single friend willing to take her in for the night, became the owner of the most reviled piece of property in Belhaven Hollow. Silas Crane, standing near the courthouse steps, allowed himself the smallest smile she had ever seen him wear, the smile of a man watching a foolish girl throw away her last coins on a heap of cursed stone. And it was that smile, more than anything else, that made her lift her chin and walk toward the ruin with what dignity she had left, determined that whatever else happened, she would not let him see her weep over it. She walked the 2 miles out along the river road that same afternoon, carrying nothing but a small bundle of clothes and the deed folded inside her bodice, and stood at last before the Belhaven Distillery in the low gold light of early evening. It was larger and sadder up close than it had ever seemed from the road. 3 stories of pale limestone, a collapsed section of roof letting the sky pour in over what had once been the mash room, doors long since fallen from their hinges, and everywhere the smell of cold stone and old rot, and, faintly, absurdly, still, a ghost of sour mash and oak. As though the building had never quite stopped remembering what it once made. She spent that first night in the driest corner she could find, on a bed of her own folded clothes, listening to owls settle into the broken rafters above her. And she told herself, with more bravado than belief, that she had at least secured herself 4 walls and a roof, however imperfect. And that come morning she would begin to see what, if anything, could be salvaged. Morning brought her a clearer eye and a cooper's habit of running her hands along wood and stone alike, testing for what was sound and what was compromised. She spent her first days simply walking the building room by room, clearing brush and fallen timber, mapping in her mind what had once been the mash house, the still room, the aging warehouse where barrels of amber whiskey had once slumbered in ordered rows. It was in the old aging warehouse, on her 4th day, running her palm along a section of interior wall out of the same idle, attentive habit her father had taught her to bring to every piece of wood and stone she touched, that she noticed something that would have meant nothing at all to anyone who had not spent a childhood reading the language of coopers. Carved discreetly into one of the bricks, low near the floor where a stack of barrels would once have hidden it entirely from view, was a small, precise mark, 2 interlocking half-circles crossed by a short straight line, The private trademark a Cooper burned or carved into work he wanted quietly claimed as his own, without announcing it to the world. Adeline had seen that exact mark once before, faded on the underside of an old barrel lid her father kept in the shop for sentiment's sake. A barrel, he told her, had been made by his own teacher, a retired cooper and distillery foreman named Jubal Reese. The mark on the brick was not decoration. It was a signature. And it told her, with a certainty that raised the hair on her arms, that this section of the old wall had not been built by masons at all, but resealed, deliberately and carefully, by a man who had once been her father's teacher, a man everyone in town remembered only as Thomas Belhaven's loyal old foreman. For the first time since her father's death, Adeline Coulter felt something other than grief move through her. She felt curiosity, sharp and clean as a blade, and beneath it, something she did not yet have a name for. The beginning of a conviction that the ruin she had bought in desperation was not, after all, quite what the town believed it to be. It took her the better part of 2 more days, working alone with a borrowed pry bar and the patient, exacting care her father had drilled into her, to loosen the bricks around that mark without bringing the wall down on herself. She worked at night as much as by day, unwilling for reasons she could not entirely articulate to be seen at her labor by anyone from town. Half afraid Silas Crane might hear of it and find some new pretext to take the property from her the way he had taken everything else. When at last a section of brick came free in her hands, she found behind it not empty space, as she had half expected, but a narrow, dry cavity built directly into the wall's original construction. A hiding place made, she understood at once, at the very time the distillery itself had been built, long before any hasty resealing by a grieving foreman. Inside, wrapped in oiled canvas gone stiff and brittle with age, she found a ledger book bound in dark leather, a small tin box, and a woman's gold locket on a broken chain. Her hands shook as she carried them out into the last of the daylight, and it was there, sitting on an overturned barrel in the ruined warehouse where whiskey had once aged in patient silence, that Adeline Coulter began to read the true history of Thomas Belhaven and to understand exactly what had been hidden and why. The ledger was written in 2 hands. The earlier entries, careful and businesslike, were Thomas Belhaven's own, records of grain purchased, barrels filled, whiskey sold, wages paid to workers whose names Adeline recognized as the grandfathers and great-uncles of families still living in Belhaven Hollow. But the entries grew increasingly troubled through the autumn of 1857, and it was here that a second, rougher hand took over. Jubal Reese's, she was certain, matching the same blunt, careful letters she had seen on old shop receipts her father kept. Reese had written what amounted to a confession and a warning, addressed to no one in particular, as though he had meant to leave it for whoever might one day be patient enough to find it. He wrote that Thomas Belhaven had discovered, in the summer of 1857, that the bank financing his distillery's expansion, the very bank whose officer was a sharp, ambitious young man named Josiah Crane, had been quietly diverting depositors' funds, including money entrusted to it by half the small farmers and shopkeepers of Belhaven Hollow, to cover Josiah Crane's own disastrous speculations in Riverland upstream. Belhaven, discovering the fraud through irregularities in his own distillery accounts, had confronted Crane privately and given him 30 days to make the depositors whole or be exposed before the bank's examiners. Reese wrote that Belhaven, being a cautious man and knowing Crane's temper, had begun quietly setting aside the distillery's true profits, gold coin, not paper, in a hidden reserve, intending to use it to protect the town's people from ruin no matter what became of the confrontation, and had sealed the growing reserve, along with copies of the falsified bank records he had gathered as proof, behind this very wall, trusting only Reese with the secret. Then, In the last days of October, Thomas Belhaven had gone to meet Josiah Crane one final time to demand restitution before the examiner's scheduled arrival, and he had never been seen again. Reese wrote, in a hand grown visibly unsteady, that he did not know for certain what had happened that night. Only that Belhaven had left the distillery in good spirits, confident of forcing Crane's hand, and had simply never come home. That within days Crane himself had begun spreading word that Belhaven had fled town a ruined embezzler, producing altered ledgers of his own to support the claim, and that Reese, an old man with no standing and no proof beyond his master's private records, had watched in helpless fury as the entire town accepted the lie. The distillery was seized and shuttered, and Josiah Crane's fortunes rose steadily thereafter, even as half the depositors he had ruined never recovered what they'd lost. Reese wrote that he had resealed the hidden reserve exactly as his master had left it, gold and evidence both, unwilling to disturb what he could not yet prove, hoping against hope that someday, some way, the truth might find daylight and Belhaven's name might find justice. And if it did not happen in his own lifetime, he prayed whoever eventually found this wall would be honest enough to finish what he could not. Adeline sat with the locket in her palm as the last light drained from the sky, and opened it at last to find a small painted portrait of a woman with kind, serious eyes, and on the reverse, engraved in careful script, the words, "To my beloved Margaret," from her husband Thomas, 1851. Thomas Belhaven had not run off in cowardly disgrace, abandoning wife and workers both. He had been silenced by a man protecting his own theft, and the town he built had spent 30 years believing a lie manufactured by the very family that had ruined it. A family whose name, she now understood with a cold jolt, still sat behind the desk of the Larkspur County Bank in the person of Silas Crane, grandson of Josiah Crane, heir to both his position and, it seemed, his methods. The tin box, when she finally worked its rusted latch free, held 11 gold coins, old and heavy, along with several folded pages in a third hand, copies, she would later confirm, of the very bank ledgers Reese's account described, showing deposits vanishing into land speculation accounts under Josiah Crane's initials. It was not, in the end, the vast, glittering fortune of legend the town had whispered about for 30 years. It was something more valuable than that. It was proof. Word of Adeline's discovery could not be kept entirely quiet. Not in a town the size of Belhaven Hollow, where a young woman seen carrying strange bundles out of a cursed ruin was bound to attract notice within days. She had told no one directly, wanting time to understand what she held before she risked losing it. But a boy who fished the mill pond had seen lamplight moving inside the warehouse at odd hours and mentioned it to his mother. And by the end of the week the story had grown, as such stories do, into a rumor that the Coulter girl had found the whole of Thomas Belhaven's stolen fortune buried in the distillery walls. It reached Silas Crane within days. He came to the ruin himself on a warm afternoon, dressed as impeccably as ever, his smile as smooth and untroubled as it had been on the courthouse steps, and he informed Adeline, with courteous regret, that any valuables discovered on the property in fact belonged to the bank, as the original debt against the distillery had never been formally cleared, only left dormant, and that as the property's prior lien holder the bank retained legal claim to anything of value found within its walls. He asked, almost gently, to see what she had found, framing it as a matter of simple procedure rather than the naked seizure it plainly was. And something in his patient, practiced calm told her that he suspected far more than gold coin might be at stake. Adeline told him nothing, and showed him nothing, though her heart hammered with the effort of appearing calmer than she felt. She had learned enough of the Crane family's methods in the space of one season to know that whatever proof she held needed witnesses before it could be trusted to daylight. And she spent the following weeks in careful, quiet work, not hiding the ledger, but copying its contents by hand, late at night, in a script deliberately not her own, so that no single document could simply be seized and burned. She sought out the oldest families in Belhaven Hollow, the ones whose grandparents' names appeared in Reese's account as depositors ruined by Josiah Crane's speculation, and she asked them, gently, whether their families had ever spoken of losses at the old bank around the time of Belhaven's disappearance. She found, to her quiet satisfaction, that several of them had, old grievances long swallowed for lack of any way to prove them. Stories of savings that vanished the same autumn Thomas Belhaven vanished, never quite connected in anyone's mind until she asked the question aloud. Silas Crane did not remain patient for long. When it became clear Adeline would not simply hand over whatever she had found, he moved to have her ownership of the distillery challenged in court, producing an old, conveniently rediscovered lien from his own bank's records that he claimed superseded the county's auction sale entirely. And for a tense fortnight it seemed entirely possible that Adeline Coulter would lose the ruin, and everything hidden within it, exactly as she had lost her father's shop before. He was, after all, a Crane, and the bank's words still carried the weight it had carried for 30 years in Belhaven Hollow. But Adeline had spent her whole short life learning to see worth where others saw only wreckage, and she had not survived this far by underestimating the value of patience, careful work, and a wall's honest testimony. The matter came to its reckoning on a bright Saturday morning, when the county circuit judge held session in the same courthouse where Adeline had once watched her father's tools sold to strangers, and where Silas Crane now stood to argue his claim upon her property before half the town, gathered as much for the spectacle as the law. Adeline stood when her turn came, and she did not raise her voice, nor did she weep, nor did she plead. She simply laid before the judge Jubal Reese's ledger in its original binding, the copied bank records showing Josiah Crane's initials beside vanished depositor funds, and the sworn statements she had quietly gathered from 3 elderly townsfolk who now recalled, with fresh and troubled clarity, exactly how much their own grandparents had lost in the very season Thomas Belhaven disappeared. She read Reese's account aloud in her own steady voice, the account of an honest man silenced and a fraud dressed up as disgrace, and she watched the color drain slowly from Silas Crane's smooth, practiced face as 3 decades of comfortable family legend came apart in open court. It was an old farmer named Hiram Beale, one of the men Adeline had spoken with, who rose unbidden from the gallery to say that his own father had gone to his grave, insisting Thomas Belhaven never stole a dime in his life, and that he for one believed the girl. Others followed, quiet at first and then with gathering conviction, the town's long-buried unease about the Crane family's fortune finding voice at last now that someone had given it proof to stand upon. Silas Crane's claim to the property was dismissed before noon, his bank's records ordered open to formal audit, and though it would be many months before the full legal reckoning of the Crane family's 30-year fraud made its way through the courts, Belhaven Hollow watched that Saturday as the comfortable, respected name of Crane began, quietly and permanently, to curdle in the mouths of its neighbors. The same slow, certain justice her father had always promised her waited patiently for those who mistook other people's ruin for their own good fortune. What mattered most to Adeline in the weeks that followed was not her own vindication, though that alone would have been sweetness enough after all she had endured. It was what she chose to do with the gold Jubal Reese had guarded so faithfully behind that wall. She could have kept it entirely for herself, and no one in Belhaven Hollow would have begrudged her a single coin, given all she had suffered. But she thought of her father's shop, and of the families whose grandparents had quietly lost their savings and never recovered, and she thought, most of all, of Thomas Belhaven himself, a man who had died trying to protect a town that had spent 30 years believing him a thief. She placed the recovered gold, along with a portion of her own small savings from the sale of her father's shop, into a community trust administered not by any bank, but by a council of the town's own families, meant to help restore what the Crane fraud had quietly stolen from Belhaven Hollow one generation before. Old debts eased, a schoolhouse roof repaired, seed corn advanced to farmers still recovering from a hard winter. And with what remained of the distillery itself, patched and rebuilt plank by plank, with her own coopering hands and the labor of townsfolk grateful enough to volunteer it, she reopened its doors under its old name, employing a dozen local families in the making of honest whiskey once again, exactly as Thomas Belhaven had first intended, 30 years before a lie had shuttered his life's work. She was 21 years old when Silas Crane cast her out with nothing but $46 and a receipt for a cursed ruin nobody else wanted, and she had bought that ruin not because she believed in curses, but because her father had taught her, patiently, over a lifetime of split staves and salvaged barrels, that the world discards far more worth than it ever discards worthlessness, if only someone is willing to look closely enough to tell the difference. What she found behind that wall was never simply gold. It was an honest man's stolen name, waiting 30 years for someone patient enough to give it back to him, and a town's stolen trust, waiting for someone brave enough to restore it without asking anything for herself in return. Adeline Coulter did not set out to become Belhaven Hollow's quiet reckoning. She set out only to survive one desperate season, with the last of her father's lessons intact. But in choosing, again and again, to see value where the world saw only ruin, she became something the whole town would remember long after the last of the Crane fortune had finally, rightfully, come undone. We hope Adeline's story stayed with you tonight, wherever you're watching from. If it did, we'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who needs to hear that overlooked things and overlooked people are so often worth far more than the world first believes. And before you go, we'd love to know, has there ever been a time in your own life when you found real value in something everyone else had already written off? Tell us about it in the comments below. We read every one, and we love hearing where this story found you. Thank you for spending this quiet hour with us. Until next time, stay close.